Are you tired of watching people who game the system climb higher while you play it straight and stay stuck? Are you exhausted from being loyal to organizations that discard you the moment the wind shifts? Are you haunted by the feeling that you're the only person bringing a handshake to a knife fight? Good. Because tonight, we're going to drift through the life of a man who saw what you see, who felt what you feel, and who had the audacity to write it all down in his infamous book, The Prince. Many people believe power rewards if you play by the rules. History quietly disagrees. The man history confuses for pure evil may have been the most honest observer of power ever born. And the question that haunted him, the question that still matters, is this: was he teaching the world how to be cruel, or simply exposing how cruel the world already was? As we dive in tonight, I'd love to know something simple. Where are you listening from right now? Not just the place, but the moment. Late night? Early morning? Somewhere in between? This quiet circle of dreamers is spread all over the world, and I enjoy picturing us listening together. 5 centuries ago, in the narrow streets of Florence, a man sat in exile. By day, he was nobody. A discarded civil servant, a failure, a joke. But at night, when he sat down at his desk to write, he became something else entirely. The most dangerous political thinker in Western history. His name was Niccolo Machiavelli, and he never ruled anything. He wasn't a king, he wasn't a general, he wasn't even particularly successful. He was a quiet observer of the world. Someone who watched power the way a doctor watches disease. Someone who studied it, dissected it, understood it so completely that rulers still read his words in secret 500 years later. Tonight, we're not going to learn how to seize power. We're going to learn how to recognize it, to understand it. We're going to watch a man who served loyally and was tortured for it, who believed in republics and advised tyrants, who loved virtue but taught cruelty, who died a nobody but became immortal. We'll see what happens when you strip away the beautiful lies we tell ourselves about leadership, loyalty, and moral authority. This isn't a biography. This is a night meditation on the nature of power, told by a man who perhaps understood it better than anyone in history. By the end, you'll start seeing the hidden levers that move the world, which will have you looking at your boss, your government, and your peers through a crystal clear lens. Welcome, Nightlings. This is Huxley. If you like listening or falling asleep to real stories that will reveal life's deeper truths, then this is the place for you. Now, dim the lights. Let your eyes grow heavy. Feel the world of modern pressure fading away into the night. The morning mist clung to Florence like a shroud. In the Piazza della Signoria, where the city's heart beat loudest, a crowd gathered. Thousands of faces, some weeping, some jeering, most just silent, watching with the peculiar fascination people have for endings. It was May 23rd, 1498, a date that would burn itself into one young observer's memory forever. A scaffold stood in the center of the square, hastily constructed but solid, functional, built not for aesthetics but for the grim work ahead. 3 nooses dangled from a heavy beam, 3 chains to hold the bodies after. Below, piles of wood, carefully arranged, waiting for flame. The air smelled of morning bread from nearby bakeries, mixed with something else. The nervous sweat of thousands of bodies pressed together. The sharp scent of fear and excitement that attends all public executions. Somewhere in that crowd stood a young man of 29. Thin. Intense. Dark eyes that missed nothing. Recently appointed to a government position he'd only barely qualified for. His name was Niccolo Machiavelli, and he was about to witness something he would never forget. The crowd stirred. A door opened in the Palazzo della Signoria. 3 men emerged, shuffling in chains. Their heads had been shaved that morning. A ritual humiliation, removing even the dignity of their hair. They wore only simple white tunics, having been formally defrocked, stripped of their Dominican robes in a ceremony that removed their religious authority along with their clothing. The first was Fra Silvestro Maruffi, 40 years old, his face blank with shock or perhaps resignation. The second was Fra Domenico de Pescia, 35, who had been Savonarola's most devoted follower. Some said he'd offered to walk through fire to prove his master's divine mission. The third was Girolamo Savonarola himself. Just 2 years earlier, this man had been the most powerful figure in Florence. Not officially, he held no political office, commanded no army, owned no property beyond his monk's cell. But when he preached, the Duomo couldn't hold the crowds that came to hear him. When he spoke of sin, wealthy Florentines burned their mirrors and fine clothes in massive bonfires right here in this square. When he condemned luxury, merchants destroyed their finest goods rather than risk his censure. When he prophesied doom, the entire city trembled and repented. For 4 years, this Dominican friar had bent Florence to his will through the sheer force of his moral certainty. He'd created what he called a Christian republic. He'd held his famous bonfires of the vanities in this very piazza, where Florentines threw dice, cosmetics, nude paintings, musical instruments, even books by Boccaccio, anything frivolous or sinful, into towering pyres that lit up the night sky. The painter Botticelli had supposedly thrown some of his own paintings into those flames, caught up in Savonarola's vision of purification. Savonarola had called Pope Alexander VI, the Borgia Pope, a servant of Satan. He'd promised Florence would become the New Jerusalem, the center of Christian renewal, richer and more glorious than ever. He'd convinced an entire sophisticated Renaissance city that purity was strength, that moral fervor was armor, that righteousness was power. But Savonarola had made one crucial mistake. One fatal miscalculation that would cost him everything. He had no army. When the tide turned, and tides always turn, mind you, he had nothing to defend himself with except his words, his righteousness, his absolute certainty that God was on his side. Pope Alexander VI excommunicated him. The Florentines, tired of his severity, turned against him. His enemies moved quickly. Now, on this May morning in 1498, the man who had ruled through moral authority alone was about to learn power's final lesson. Fra Silvestro was hanged first, then Fra Domenico, then Savonarola climbed the ladder. The executioner mocked him, delayed the drop, wanted the flames to reach him before the rope finished its work. but the rope won. Savonarola died by strangulation around 10 in the morning. He was 45 years old. As the flames engulfed the three bodies, something strange happened. The heat made Savonarola's right arm move. It looked like he was blessing the crowd. Some people burst into tears. Others laughed. Children danced around the pyre, throwing stones at the corpses. When it was over, the ashes were thrown into the Arno River. No relics, no shrine, no trace that he'd ever existed except for the memory of crowds watching him burn. Young Machiavelli stood in that crowd watching the same people who'd obeyed Savonarola's every word now celebrate his death. Watching morality crumble in a single morning. Watching virtue collapse into ash. And in that moment, a question took root in Machiavelli's mind that would haunt him for the rest of his life. What good is righteousness if it cannot protect itself? He would spend the next 30 years trying to answer that question, and his answer would terrify the world. If these stories speak to you, if you find comfort in the lessons found in the quiet corners of history, then share your favorite episode that might help a friend. Tap the follow button to join our circle of dreamers, and let the next story find you when you need it most. To understand Niccolo Machiavelli, you must first understand the city that made him. Florence in the late 1400s was a paradox wrapped in marble and blood. On one hand, the Renaissance, the rebirth of learning, of art, of human possibility. Michelangelo would soon carve David from a discarded block of stone. Leonardo da Vinci would paint The Last Supper. Dante's poetry would inspire generations to reach for heaven while remaining human. On the other hand, chaos. Italy was not a country. It was a peninsula of warring city-states, each one a miniature empire with its own army, its own ambitions, its own grudges stretching back centuries. Florence competed with Milan, Venice, Rome, Naples. Popes commanded armies. Mercenaries sold their swords to the highest bidder and switched sides mid-battle if the price was right. Foreign powers, France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, viewed Italy as a chessboard where they could play out their ambitions. They invaded regularly, installing puppet rulers, extracting tribute, treating Italian politics like a marketplace where everything had a price. This was the world young Niccolo inherited when he was born on May 3rd, 1469. His father, Bernardo Machiavelli, was a lawyer, educated but not wealthy, connected but not powerful. The family lived modestly in Florence, close enough to the halls of power to see them clearly, too far away to enter them without effort. His mother, Bartolomea de Nelli, was devout and literary. She wrote hymns. She taught her children to read. She believed, as many did, that words could change the world. Young Niccolo absorbed both influences, his father's pragmatic understanding of law and obligation, his mother's faith in the power of language. But more than anything, he absorbed Florence itself. Florence taught you to watch carefully, to notice whose alliances shifted, to track which merchant families were rising and which were falling, to understand that the beautiful facade of civic virtue often concealed something else entirely: calculation, ambition, fear. For most of Niccolo's childhood, Florence was ruled, unofficially but absolutely, by the Medici family. Lorenzo de' Medici, Il Magnifico, was not technically a king or duke. Florence was nominally a republic. But Lorenzo controlled the banks, the patronage networks, the military contracts. He sponsored artists and philosophers. He negotiated with foreign powers. He was, in every way that mattered, the de facto prince of Florence. Young Machiavelli watched this with fascination. Here was a man who ruled without a crown, who commanded without official title, who held power through the intricate web of debt, loyalty, and calculated generosity. It was a masterclass in what would later be called soft power. Lorenzo gave gifts that created obligations. He elevated families that could serve him and quietly crushed those who challenged him. He maintained the illusion of republican government while ensuring that every lever of power ran through his hands. And then Lorenzo died in 1492 at age 43. Il Magnifico succumbed to illness. His death left a vacuum. His son, Piero de' Medici, inherited the position but not the skill. Piero was arrogant, clumsy, easily manipulated. Within 2 years, he would make a catastrophic mistake that would change Florence and Machiavelli's life forever. In 1494, the French king Charles VIII invaded Italy with the largest army Italy had seen in generations. The Italian city-states, accustomed to small-scale conflicts decided by mercenary captains, were unprepared for this level of force. Piero de' Medici, in a panic, made concessions to the French without consulting Florence's government. He essentially handed over key Florentine fortresses to avoid conflict. The Florentine people, furious at this cowardice and betrayal, rose up. They stormed the Medici palace. They expelled Piero and his family from the city. They declared Florence a republic once more. Machiavelli was 25 years old, and he learned his second lesson about power. It does not matter how long your family has ruled. It does not matter how much wealth you've accumulated. If you show weakness at a critical moment, the crowd that once kissed your ring will chase you through the streets. But the lesson was more complex than simple populism. Because the Florentines who expelled the Medici did not actually want chaos. They wanted order. They wanted security. They wanted someone to believe in. And into that vacuum stepped the prophet with the burning eyes, Girolamo Savonarola. The years immediately after the Medici expulsion were strange, almost dreamlike in their intensity. Florence, freed from the soft tyranny of the Medici, experienced a kind of collective moral fever. Savonarola's preaching filled the void left by the absence of strong leadership. He convinced Florentines that their suffering, the invasions, the instability, the fear, was divine punishment for their sins. The solution? Purification, repentance, renewal. For a time, it worked, or seemed to work. The city rallied around a shared sense of purpose. Crime dropped. Public morality became a social competition. Florence felt briefly like it might transcend the brutal logic of power politics through sheer spiritual force. Young Machiavelli watched this with the detached curiosity of someone who wanted to believe but couldn't quite manage it. He had seen the Medici fall. He had seen the French army march through. He had seen the crowd's mood shift like weather. One day worshipping Lorenzo, the next day worshipping Savonarola, unable to articulate what exactly had changed except that someone new was speaking, and the words felt true in the moment. In 1498, Savonarola fell. We've already witnessed that morning, that fire, that lesson. But what happened next is equally important to Machiavelli's education. The city needed a new government. The restored republic needed administrators, diplomats, officials who could navigate the treacherous landscape of Italian politics without the Medici's money or Savonarola's charisma. And somehow, Improbably, a middle-class nobody named Niccolo Machiavelli got his chance. In June 1498, just weeks after Savonarola's execution, the 29-year-old Machiavelli was appointed head of the Second Chancery of Florence and secretary to the Ten of War, the committee responsible for foreign affairs and defense. How did this happen? We don't entirely know. Machiavelli had no military experience. He had never held significant office. But he was educated, literate in Latin, capable of writing clear diplomatic dispatches. And perhaps most importantly, he had no strong factional loyalties. He wasn't a Medici partisan. He wasn't a Savonarola fanatic. He was simply available. This is one of power's strange ironies. Sometimes competence matters less than neutrality. Sometimes you rise not because you're the best, but because you're the one who doesn't make anyone nervous. Machiavelli accepted the position with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. Here was his entry into the world he'd been watching from the outside. Here was his chance to see power from the inside. He had no idea that this would become both his education and his ruin. His job, in essence, was to be Florence's eyes and ears abroad, to travel to other Italian courts as an envoy, to negotiate with foreign powers, to assess military threats, to recommend strategies. It sounds straightforward. It was anything but. Because in Renaissance Italy, every negotiation was layered with deception. Every alliance was temporary. Every promise came with invisible conditions. Rulers lied as easily as they breathed, and the diplomat who took statements at face value was a fool who wouldn't last long. Machiavelli learned quickly. Never believe what people say. Watch what they do. The prince who swears eternal friendship while quietly moving troops toward your border is not your friend. The Pope who preaches peace while funding mercenaries to invade your territory is not a holy father. The mercenary captain who promises loyalty will abandon you the moment someone offers better pay. This was not cynicism. This was pattern recognition. And Machiavelli, it turned out, was very good at recognizing patterns. His early diplomatic reports show a mind that could cut through rhetoric to identify real incentives. He didn't write flowery dispatches praising foreign rulers. He wrote cold assessments. This ruler is weak and can be pressed. That one is overextended and will collapse if we wait. This alliance is genuine because their interests align. That one is theatre because both parties are secretly negotiating elsewhere. He was becoming an expert in something that had no name yet, but would eventually be called realpolitik. The politics of reality, stripped of moral pretense. And his first major mission would take him to study under the most dangerous teacher he would ever encounter. But before we follow Machiavelli to that dark education, we need to understand why Savonarola's ghost would haunt him for the rest of his life. Because Machiavelli didn't just witness Savonarola's fall, he analyzed it, dissected it, tried to understand exactly where the logic broke down. Savonarola had everything a leader needs, except the one thing that makes all the others durable. He had charisma, the ability to move crowds with words, to inspire devotion, to create belief where there had been cynicism. He had moral authority, or at least the appearance of it. His personal life was ascetic. He didn't enrich himself. He seemed genuinely motivated by spiritual conviction rather than worldly ambition. He had popular support. For a time, most of Florence followed him willingly. His sermons packed the Duomo. His reforms were implemented. His vision was shared by thousands. But he had no sword, no army loyal to him personally, no military force that could protect him when the political winds shifted, no capacity for physical coercion when persuasion failed. And in the end, it was men with swords, the Pope's forces, the Florentine government's guards, the executioner's rope, who decided his fate. Machiavelli would write about this with almost surgical precision in The Prince. He would say, "The nature of peoples is variable. It is easy to persuade them of something, but difficult to keep them in that persuasion. Therefore, one must order things so that when they no longer believe, they can be made to believe by force." He would list the great religious and political leaders of history and divide them into two categories: armed prophets who succeeded, unarmed prophets who failed. Moses, armed, led the Israelites with divine authority, but also with military force. Succeeded in establishing a lasting nation. Jesus, unarmed. Inspired billions but was executed. His movement survived only because later followers did pick up swords, did build institutions with enforcement mechanisms. Savonarola, unarmed. Inspired thousands but burned when the crowd's mood changed. This was not a celebration of violence. It was an observation about durability. Love, Machiavelli was concluding, is a beautiful but unreliable foundation for power, because love is conditional. People love you when you make them feel good, when your message resonates with their current emotional state, when loving you costs them nothing. But the moment circumstances change, when following you becomes inconvenient, when external pressure makes it dangerous to support you, when a new voice offers something more appealing, love evaporates. Fear, on the other hand, is predictable. Not the fear of random cruelty or sadistic violence, but the fear that comes from knowing consequences are real, that rules will be enforced, that certain lines cannot be crossed without response. This kind of fear, structural, predictable, impersonal, creates order. And here's the uncomfortable truth that Machiavelli was beginning to grasp. Most people, most of the time, prefer order to freedom. They want security, more than they want self-governance. They will tolerate injustice if it comes with stability, and they will rebel against justice if it comes with chaos. Savonarola had offered them moral clarity. But moral clarity is cold comfort when foreign armies are invading, when trade collapses, when the cost of purity is poverty. The Florentines loved Savonarola until they didn't. And the transition from worship to execution happened so quickly that it revealed something essential. Public opinion is not a foundation. It's weather. You cannot build on weather. You can only build on force and self-interest. Then decorate that foundation with whatever moral language makes people comfortable. Now, I should say, this is not an instruction manual for becoming a tyrant. This is an observation that crowds are remarkably moral, right up until dinner is delayed. Most people are one missed meal away from reconsidering their principles. Savonarola learned this the hard way. You probably learned it the first time you stood in a long line at the DMV and watched normally polite humans transform into barely contained rage monsters because the system was moving too slowly. The same impulse, the same pattern, different era. Machiavelli just had the unfortunate honesty to write it down. And so, armed with the knowledge that virtue alone would not protect him, that words alone would not secure Florence's future, Machiavelli prepared for his next assignment. He was about to meet a man who understood force intimately, who wielded cruelty like a surgeon's scalpel, who demonstrated in the most visceral way possible, what happens when you combine vision with violence. Cesare Borgia was waiting, and Machiavelli, unknowingly, was about to attend the darkest seminar in leadership he would ever experience. Several of Borgia's own lieutenants, mercenary captains who had helped him conquer territory, Machiavelli was shaken, not by the violence itself. Violence was common in Renaissance Italy, but by the precision, by the patience, by the way Borgia had turned his enemies' trust against them. Most people think of betrayal as a hot emotion, anger, revenge, impulse. But what Machiavelli witnessed was cold. It was premeditated theatre. Borgia had let his enemies believe they had leverage, had let them feel safe enough to gather in one place, and then had eliminated them in a single stroke. This was cruelty with purpose, cruelty with timing, cruelty that ended a problem rather than prolonging it. And as much as it disturbed him, Machiavelli had to admit, it worked. In the weeks that followed, Machiavelli studied Borgia more closely. He watched how Borgia governed the territories he'd conquered. And here was another surprise. Once the violence was done, once the opposition was crushed, Borgia actually governed fairly well. He installed competent administrators. He established clear laws. He reduced banditry. He created a kind of brutal peace. People resented him, but they obeyed him, and gradually the regions under his control stabilized. One particular story haunted Machiavelli. When Borgia first conquered the Romagna region, it was chaotic, plagued by crime, ruled by corrupt local lords, lawless and unstable. Borgia needed to impose order quickly and decisively. He appointed a man named Ramiro de Orco as his governor. De Orco was cruel, efficient, merciless. He crushed dissent. He executed criminals publicly. He made examples of anyone who challenged authority. It worked. Within months, Romagna was orderly and peaceful. Crime plummeted. Trade resumed. But now, Borgia had a problem. The people hated de Orco. They obeyed out of terror, but resentment was building. If Borgia kept de Orco in power, that resentment would eventually transfer to Borgia himself. So Borgia did something shocking. One morning, the people of Cesena, a city in Romagna, woke to find the body of Ramiro de Orco in the town square. He had been cut in half, a bloody knife placed beside him. The message was clear. The brutality was not Borgia's policy. It was de Orco's cruelty. And Borgia had punished that cruelty. It was brilliant and horrifying. Borgia had used de Orco to establish order through terror. Then he'd sacrificed de Orco to cleanse himself of association with that terror. The people of Romagna, rather than hating Borgia, felt relieved, protected. They believed Borgia had rescued them from a tyrant, the tyrant that Borgia himself had appointed, that Borgia had directed, that Borgia had used as a tool and then discarded when the tool became a liability. Machiavelli would later write about this incident with a kind of awed horror. He would say that Borgia's action left the people satisfied and stupefied. Satisfied because order had been restored and the cruel governor punished. Stupefied because they couldn't quite process that they'd been manipulated. That the entire sequence, the cruelty, the relief, the gratitude, had been orchestrated. This was not just political strategy. This was psychological engineering. And Machiavelli, trying to advise Florence on how to deal with Borgia, found himself facing an uncomfortable realization. If I were Borgia, and I wanted to build a stable principality from chaos, I might do exactly the same thing. Not because it's moral, but because it works. Let me ask you a question. Take your time. Let it settle. Who have you obeyed longer in your life? Those who loved you, or those who could remove something important from you? Not who did you enjoy obeying more, not who made you feel better about yourself, but who did you actually, consistently, predictably obey? Your answer to that question is the same answer Machiavelli reached after months of observing Cesare Borgia. He would write in The Prince one of the most infamous lines in political philosophy. It is much safer for a prince to be feared than loved. And for 500 years people have read that line and concluded that Machiavelli was advocating cruelty, that he was telling rulers to terrorize their subjects, that he was endorsing tyranny. But that's not what he said, or meant. He continued, nevertheless, he should be very careful not to be hated. Fear and hatred are not the same thing. Fear can coexist with respect. Hatred cannot. What Machiavelli observed, in Borgia's court, in the collapse of Savonarola, in every interaction between rulers and subjects he witnessed, was that love is conditional and fear is structural. Love depends on circumstances staying pleasant, on the leader continuing to provide benefits, on the relationship remaining emotionally satisfying. Love, in other words, is a fair-weather foundation. The moment things get difficult, the moment the leader asks for sacrifice, or makes an unpopular decision, or simply stops providing the emotional reward people expect, love evaporates. Machiavelli quotes a proverb. Men love at their own free will, but fear at the will of the prince. You cannot make someone love you. You can inspire it. You can encourage it. You can create conditions where love might grow, but ultimately, love is a gift they give or withhold based on their feelings. Fear, on the other hand, you can create deliberately. You can make it predictable. You can calibrate it. You can use it to establish boundaries that, paradoxically, make people feel safer rather than oppressed. Think about a modern workplace. The manager who tries to be everyone's friend, who avoids difficult conversations, who never enforces standards because they want to be loved. That manager presides over chaos. People respect them less, not more. The team underperforms because there are no real consequences for underperformance. The manager who establishes clear expectations, who enforces boundaries consistently, who creates predictable consequences, that manager might not be loved. But they're respected. The team knows where they stand, and paradoxically, that clarity creates a kind of safety. Machiavelli was observing the same dynamic at the level of nations. Cesare Borgia was not loved by the people of Romagna, but he was obeyed. And once the initial violence had established order, life actually improved for most people. Less crime, more stability, clearer rules. Savonarola was deeply loved by the people of Florence. But when external pressure arrived, when the Pope demanded his arrest, when political expediency required his sacrifice, the love disappeared. The same crowds that had wept at his sermons watched his execution without protest. Love is beautiful. Love is valuable. Love makes life worth living. But love is not a reliable basis for governance, because governance requires making decisions that won't always feel good in the moment, even if they're necessary for long-term stability. Fear, the right kind of fear, predictable and proportional, creates a foundation where governance becomes possible. This doesn't mean cruelty for its own sake. It means consequences that are real. It means people understanding that certain actions will result in certain responses every time, without exception. It means the leader not outsourcing enforcement to the whims of public opinion or personal affection. Machiavelli himself would never have put it this way, but he was describing what modern psychology calls boundary setting. The parent who loves their child but establishes clear, consistent consequences is not being cruel. They're providing structure. The leader who cares about their people but will not tolerate behavior that undermines the common good is not a tyrant. They're maintaining order. The problem, of course, is that fear can become tyranny. It can metastasize into random cruelty, into sadism, into the kind of terror that does breed hatred, which is why Machiavelli added that crucial qualifier. The prince must avoid being hated. How? By not taking people's property capriciously, by not attacking their families without cause, by making the violence, when it comes, seem just, or at least necessary. The people of Romagna didn't hate Borgia because he'd executed criminals and rebels. They would have hated him if he'd started confiscating farms randomly, if he'd attacked innocent families, if his cruelty had seemed personal rather than systematic. This is the tightrope Machiavelli was describing. Be feared enough that your authority is real, but be just enough that your subjects don't dream of your death. And the honest truth that makes everyone uncomfortable is this. Most people prefer a fair tyrant to a weak democracy. They prefer predictable autocracy to chaotic freedom. They want order more than they want choice. This is not because humans are naturally servile. It's because most humans, most of the time, are trying to survive, to feed their families, to live without constant fear of violence or chaos. And they will accept almost any government that provides that basic stability. Savonarola offered them moral purity. They loved him until it became inconvenient. Borgia offered them order. They feared him but didn't rebel, because the alternative, chaos, was worse. This is the calculus Machiavelli was mapping, not because he loved it, but because it was true. While Machiavelli was studying Borgia's brutal effectiveness, he was also learning an equally important lesson about what doesn't work. Mercenaries. Renaissance Italy was awash in mercenary armies. Condottieri, professional military captains who commanded bands of soldiers and rented them out to the highest bidder. It was a sensible system, in theory. Most Italian city-states were commercial republics run by merchants, not warriors. They had wealth, but not military tradition. So they did what merchants do. They bought what they needed. Need an army? Hire one. Need to defend your territory? Pay someone to fight for you? Need to conquer a rival city? Negotiate with a condottiero. Agree on terms, deploy them, and collect your victory. In theory, this should have worked. In practice, it was a disaster. And Machiavelli watched that disaster unfold repeatedly throughout his diplomatic career. The problem with buying loyalty is that loyalty, by definition, cannot be bought. You can buy service. You can buy temporary alignment of interest. But you cannot buy the thing that makes service reliable when circumstances shift. Genuine investment in the outcome. Mercenaries fought for money, which meant they fought only as hard as necessary to justify continued payment. They avoided battles that might result in heavy casualties, because dead soldiers couldn't be rented out for the next contract. They changed sides mid-campaign if someone offered better terms. Most infamously, they sometimes negotiated with each other to avoid actual combat. Two mercenary armies would march toward each other, put on a show of military maneuvering, then agree privately that neither would press an advantage too hard. After all, they were professionals. Why risk death fighting over some merchant city's territorial dispute? Machiavelli saw this over and over. Florence would hire an army. The army would march. The enemy would hire a different army. The two armies would engage in what looked like warfare, but felt more like theatre. Eventually, one side would declare victory based on some minor skirmish, collect payment, and move on. It was inefficient, expensive, and deeply unreliable. Worse, mercenaries were loyal only until a better offer arrived. Machiavelli watched condottieri switch sides between campaigns, fighting for Florence one year, against Florence the next, back to Florence the year after that. How could you build a stable state when the very army defending you might be defending your enemy 6 months from now? In 1506, after years of watching this dysfunction, Machiavelli convinced Florence to try something radical: create a citizen militia. Not professional soldiers, not hired fighters. Citizens, farmers, craftsmen, merchants, men who lived in Florence and had a genuine stake in its survival. The idea was controversial. Some argued that civilians couldn't match professional soldiers in skill or discipline. Others worried that an armed populace might threaten the government. But Machiavelli argued that loyalty mattered more than expertise, that men defending their own homes would fight harder than men defending someone else's paycheck. Florence approved the experiment. Machiavelli oversaw the recruitment and training, and in 1509, this citizen militia achieved what Florence's hired armies had failed to do for years. They recaptured Pisa. It wasn't a flawless victory. The militia had its problems: discipline issues, coordination challenges, limitations in equipment. But they won. And they won, in part, because they cared about the outcome in a way mercenaries never could. This experience crystallized one of Machiavelli's core beliefs. Institutions built on transactional loyalty are fragile. Institutions built on genuine investment, even if imperfect, are durable. Now you might be thinking, what does this have to do with me? I'm not hiring mercenary armies, but you are, in a sense, navigating a world of transactional relationships. The colleague who's friendly until a better job offer arrives. The friend who's loyal until the social cost of that loyalty becomes inconvenient. The corporation that preaches we're a family while planning layoffs. The politician who promises principles while calculating expediency. Modern life is full of mercenaries. Not literal soldiers, but people whose loyalty is conditional on continued benefit. Machiavelli's lesson isn't cynicism, it's clarity. He's not saying everyone will betray you. He's saying, understand what actually binds people to you. Understand the difference between genuine investment and performed loyalty. Build your life, your institutions, your commitments on foundations that don't evaporate when tested. The mercenary fights until the pay stops. The citizen fights until the threat ends. One is doing a job. The other is protecting something irreplaceable. Which relationships in your life are transactional? Which are foundational? And more importantly, which do you think are foundational but are actually transactional? Mercenaries you've mistaken for citizens. Machiavelli learned to distinguish them. It's a skill that cost him dearly when he failed to apply it to his own situation. But we'll get there soon enough. You know, there's a modern version of this mercenary problem. It's called company loyalty. Most people are loyal to their employer right up until a better offer appears, or until the company decides loyalty means expecting you to work weekends without additional pay. The corporation preaches we're a family, while maintaining a legal department specifically trained to sever family ties efficiently. Machiavelli would look at modern corporate culture and nod slowly. Yes, he'd say, This is exactly what I warned you about. Transactional loyalty dressed up as virtue. Mercenaries in business casual. Of course, he'd also probably be impressed by the sophistication of modern HR departments. Renaissance mercenaries were at least honest about being mercenaries. They didn't pretend you were part of the family while calculating your severance package. Progress, I suppose. Machiavelli left Borgia's court in early 1503, returning to Florence with notebooks full of observations and a mind churning with uncomfortable conclusions. He had learned that effective governance requires force, that love is beautiful but unreliable, that loyalty cannot be purchased, only earned through genuine shared interest. But he had also learned something else, something he hadn't expected. Cesare Borgia, for all his skill and ruthlessness, was ultimately vulnerable to something beyond his control. Fortune, Fortuna, luck, fate, circumstances beyond anyone's ability to predict or manage. In August 1503, Pope Alexander VI died suddenly. His son Cesare, who had built his entire power base on his father's support, found himself abruptly without protection. Rival families moved against him. Former allies abandoned him. The territories he'd conquered rebelled. Within months, the man Machiavelli had studied as a model of effective power was imprisoned, exiled, eventually killed in an obscure skirmish in Spain at age 31. All that calculation, all that cruelty, all that careful construction of power, undone by something as simple as an old man dying unexpectedly. And Machiavelli, watching this reversal from Florence, learned perhaps the most important lesson of all. No matter how skillful you are, no matter how prepared, fortune can destroy you in an instant. The only question is, when fortune turns, will you adapt? Or will you cling to the methods that worked before and watch them fail you now? Cesare Borgia couldn't adapt. His specific skill set, violence backed by papal authority, became useless when his father died. But Machiavelli was about to face his own test of adaptation, and it would teach him more about power than all his years of observing others ever could. For 14 years, Niccolo Machiavelli served Florence. Not for glory, his position never brought him fame. Not for wealth, his salary was modest and often delayed. Not even for power, really, because as a civil servant he had influence, but never true authority. He served because he believed in something larger than himself. The Florentine Republic. The idea that citizens could govern themselves without kings or emperors. That merit and wisdom might matter more than bloodlines. That there could be, somewhere in this brutal world, a space where human beings organized themselves through reason rather than force. It was perhaps the one naive belief Machiavelli allowed himself to hold. He traveled constantly. Missions to France, to the court of Maximilian in Germany, to the papal court in Rome. He negotiated with kings and cardinals. He assessed military threats. He wrote hundreds of diplomatic dispatches, clear, precise analyses of power dynamics across Europe. His superiors came to rely on him. Piero Soderini, Florence's gonfaloniere, essentially the Republic's chief executive, trusted Machiavelli's judgment. When complex negotiations required someone who could read between the lines, who could identify hidden motives, who could advise on the true balance of forces, they sent Machiavelli. He was good at his job, perhaps too good. He began to believe that competence mattered, that being right, being useful, being indispensable would protect him. This was his mistake. Because in those 14 years, while Machiavelli was analyzing everyone else's power dynamics, he failed to see the one that would destroy him. The Medici were not gone. They were merely waiting. After their expulsion in 1494, The Medici family had scattered across Europe, but they maintained their wealth, their connections, their ambitions. And they were patient. Patient in the way that old families are patient, thinking in generations, not years. In 1512, the political landscape of Italy shifted suddenly. Pope Julius II, the warrior pope who had spent years building papal power, changed his alliances. He had originally supported Florence, but now he saw advantage in backing Spain against France. Spanish troops with papal blessing invaded Tuscany. Their target was not Florence's territory. It was Florence's government. The republic that had expelled the Medici needed to be eliminated so that the Medici could return. Florence tried to resist. The citizen militia that Machiavelli had built fought bravely. But citizen soldiers, no matter how motivated, could not match professional armies with artillery and cavalry. The Spanish broke through. Prato, a nearby town, was sacked with such violence that Florence panicked. Rather than face similar destruction, the city capitulated. In September 1512, the Medici marched back into Florence. Not as citizens, as rulers. The Republic was dissolved. Piero Soderini fled into exile, and everyone who had served the Republican government was now suspect. Machiavelli watched this unfold with a kind of numb horror. Everything he'd studied, everything he'd written about in his diplomatic reports was now happening to him. He was living through one of those sudden reversals of fortune that he'd analyzed so clinically when they happened to others. He had warned Florence about mercenaries and been proven right when their hired armies failed. He had explained how republics were vulnerable to unified autocratic force, and now he watched his own republic collapse. He had written about the importance of military strength backing political institutions, and now saw how quickly institutions crumbled when that strength evaporated. The irony was almost cruel. He had become an expert in power by observing its mechanisms. But expertise in observation is not the same as possession of power. And when power shifts, observers are just as vulnerable as anyone else. More vulnerable, actually, because they know too much without having the means to protect themselves. On November 7th, 1512, Niccolo Machiavelli was dismissed from his position. 14 years of service, hundreds of missions, countless reports, a lifetime of loyalty, ended with a letter. Your services are no longer required. He was 43 years old. He had no other skills, no other profession. His entire adult life had been spent in government service. And now that government no longer existed, he returned to his small farm outside Florence, a property he'd inherited from his father. It was humble. A farmhouse, some land, enough to survive but nothing more. He had a wife, Marietta, and several children to support. And he had time, endless, aching time to think about how everything had gone wrong. But at least he was alive. At least he was free. At least he could rebuild some kind of life, even if it meant leaving politics behind. This hope lasted 3 months. February 1513. Word reached Florence of a conspiracy. Several young men, disaffected Republicans who hated the Medici, had been meeting secretly, planning some kind of action against the new regime. It wasn't a serious threat. The conspirators were idealistic but disorganized, more talk than capability. But the Medici, newly returned to power and paranoid about their hold on the city, decided to make examples of them. The conspirators were arrested, their possessions searched, their papers examined, and on one of those papers, a list, possibly of people the conspirators hoped to recruit, possibly just names of known Republicans, appeared the name Niccolo Machiavelli. He had no knowledge of the conspiracy. He had never met with these young men. He had been on his farm, trying to survive, trying to stay out of politics, but his name was on a list. And that was enough. The guards came at night. They dragged him from his home while his wife and children watched in terror. They took him to the Bargello, Florence's fortress prison, dark and cold, built to hold enemies of the state. They threw him in a cell. No charges, no trial. No explanation beyond, your name appeared. You will answer for it. Machiavelli was terrified. This is what he had studied, what he had written about. How governments maintain power through fear, through the demonstration that dissent has consequences, through making examples of anyone who might threaten stability. He had analyzed this mechanism. He had explained it. He had even, in some abstract way, understood why it was necessary for rulers to occasionally display such force. But understanding something intellectually and experiencing it viscerally are two entirely different things. In that cell, Machiavelli was not a political theorist. He was a frightened man who knew exactly what happened to suspected conspirators. He'd seen the bodies displayed in public squares. He'd written diplomatic reports about executions. He'd studied how rulers used terror as a tool. And now he was the tool being used. He was the message being sent. He was the example. The Medici officials conducting the investigation faced a dilemma. They wanted information. They wanted names. They wanted to expand the conspiracy to justify further crackdowns, to eliminate more potential threats. But Machiavelli couldn't give them what they wanted. So they escalated. They decided to apply a technique that was common in Renaissance Italy. A technique designed to extract truth from those who claimed innocence. A technique that would teach Machiavelli more about power than all his years of diplomatic observation. The Strappado. Picture this carefully, because it's important to understand what happens when political theory meets physical reality. The Strappado is simple in its brutality. Your hands are bound behind your back. Wrists tied together with rough rope. The rope is attached to a pulley on the ceiling. You're hoisted up, lifted by your arms, which are wrenched backward and upward, your entire body weight pulling on your shoulder joints. The pain is immediate and overwhelming. Your shoulders begin to dislocate. Your arms feel like they're being torn from your body. But that's just the beginning. After you're lifted, after you're hanging there, after the pain has built to the point where you think you cannot endure another second, they drop you. Not all the way to the ground, just a few feet. Enough for the sudden jerk to complete what gravity started. Your shoulders pop from their sockets. The rope bites deeper. The pain transcends anything you imagined pain could be. Then they hoist you up again, and drop you again, and again and again. Between each drop, they ask their questions. Niccolo Machiavelli, who had written about the necessity of force in politics, who had studied Caesar Borgia's calculated cruelties, who had observed how fear maintained order, Niccolo Machiavelli hung from a rope and learned what it feels like to be the subject of someone else's political calculus. He screamed. Everyone screamed. There is no dignity in the Strappado, no stoic resistance. The human body simply cannot maintain composure under that kind of assault. Between the drops, they asked their questions. Who were your accomplices? What was the plan? Who else should we arrest? And Machiavelli, through the pain, through the delirium, kept saying the same thing. I know nothing. I was not involved. I am innocent. Perhaps they believed him. Perhaps they didn't. Perhaps it didn't matter, because the point of torture is rarely to extract truth. Truth is too ambiguous, too slippery. The point is to demonstrate power, to show that the state can reach into your body and break it, to make you understand at a cellular level that you exist at the mercy of forces you cannot control. The irony was not lost on Machiavelli. Even in his agony, some part of his mind, the analytical part, the part that never stopped observing, recognized the pattern. This is what I wrote about. This is how power works. This is the mechanism I explained so clinically in my reports. But knowing the mechanism doesn't make you immune to it. Understanding the theory doesn't spare you the experience. He was tortured 6 times. 6 sessions of the Strappado. His shoulders never fully healed. For the rest of his life, he would have limited mobility in his arms, chronic pain, physical memory of those drops. But he gave them nothing, because he had nothing to give. And eventually, his captors faced a decision. They could kill him, execute him as a conspirator based on nothing but suspicion. Or they could release him and risk looking foolish for having tortured an innocent man. They were saved from this choice by fortune, the kind of random luck that shapes history more than any amount of planning. In March 1513, Pope Julius II died. His successor, elected quickly, was Giovanni de' Medici, who took the name Pope Leo X. The Medici family had produced a pope. This was cause for celebration. And new popes traditionally marked their ascension with acts of mercy, general amnesties, releasing prisoners, gestures of magnanimity. Leo X ordered the release of political prisoners in Florence. Machiavelli walked out of the Bargello on shaking legs, his arms barely functional, his body broken, his mind racing. He was 43 years old. He had lost his career. He had been tortured by the state he'd served. And he was being sent back to his farm not because he was innocent. No one had declared him innocent. But because a pope had been elected and tradition required mercy. Fortune. Pure fortune. The same force he'd seen destroy Cesare Borgia had, through some cosmic irony, saved Niccolo Machiavelli. If Julius II had lived another year, Machiavelli might have died in that prison. If the conspiracy had been discovered a month later, he might have been released before arrest. If his name hadn't appeared on that list, a list he knew nothing about, none of this would have happened. He had spent his career trying to understand how to master fortune, how to shape circumstances, how to prepare for every contingency, and fortune had simply reached down and crushed him. Then, equally arbitrarily, let him live. The lesson was clear, even if it was almost too painful to acknowledge. You can study power all you want. You can understand its mechanisms. You can see the patterns. But that understanding will not protect you. Because at the end of the day, you are not the one holding the rope. You are not the one making the decision. You are not the one with power. You are the one dangling. And all your careful analysis, all your shrewd observations, all your brilliant dispatches, they mean nothing when someone else holds the power to lift you up or let you drop. This was not a lesson Machiavelli wanted to learn, but it was the lesson that mattered most, because it transformed him from an observer of power into someone who understood it from the inside, from the position of the powerless, from the perspective of the one being crushed. and that perspective would make his later writing more honest and more disturbing than anything any political theorist had produced before. Sant'Andrea in Percussina, a tiny village 7 miles outside Florence. This is where Niccolo Machiavelli would spend the next 14 years. Not by choice. He was officially exiled from Florence proper, forbidden from entering the city, from participating in government, from returning to the life he'd built. The farm was small. The house was modest. The land produced wine and olive oil. Enough to survive, not enough to prosper. His wife, Marietta, managed the household. His children grew up in rural poverty, watching their father, who had once negotiated with kings, now arguing with peasants over grape harvests. Machiavelli was lost. In his letters to friends, you can feel the desperation, the humiliation, the grinding boredom of days spent doing manual labor and listening to provincial gossip. He wrote to Francesco Vittori, his closest friend, a diplomat who still had access to the Medici court, and described his daily routine. In the morning, he would check on the woodcutters, listen to their complaints about the roads, about the weather, about their petty disputes. He would spend hours in the woods, walking, thinking, carrying a book of poetry, Dante or Petrarch or Ovid, trying to remember that he was once an educated man. In the afternoon, he would go to the local inn, a shabby place where local men gathered to drink cheap wine and play cards. Machiavelli would join them, the former ambassador to France, sitting with farmers and laborers, gambling for pennies, listening to their vulgar jokes and provincial concerns. He described this with a mixture of self-mockery and genuine sadness. "I roll around in the mud," he wrote, "with these lice." But then, and this is where something remarkable happened, he described his evenings. When night came, when the day's humiliations were over, Machiavelli would return to his study. He would remove his mud-stained clothes. He would put on the robes he had worn as a diplomat, the formal dress of the court, the clothing of his former life, and he would sit among his books. "I enter the ancient courts of ancient men," he wrote to Vittori. "I'm not ashamed to speak with them and ask them the reasons for their actions. And they, in their humanity, answer me." For 4 hours each night, Machiavelli disappeared from his exile. He conversed with Livy, with Plutarch, with Tacitus. He studied Aristotle and Cicero. He lost himself in the history of Rome, of Greece, of ancient power struggles that echoed his own experiences. And in that nightly escape, something shifted. The noise stopped. The constant activity of his former life, the missions, the negotiations, the urgent dispatches, the need to react to immediate crises, all of it fell away. And in its place came something he'd never had before: distance. Distance creates clarity. When you're inside power, when you're reacting to events, when you're trying to survive from day to day, you cannot see the patterns. You're too close, too invested, too busy. But from exile, removed from the game, no longer a player, but merely an observer again. Albeit an observer with fresh wounds and hard-earned understanding, Machiavelli could finally see power as a system, as a force that operated according to rules that most people didn't want to acknowledge. He had watched rulers rise and fall. He had seen republics collapse and tyrants flourish. He had analyzed the difference between leaders who succeeded and leaders who failed. He had felt the difference between being the one who holds the rope and the one who hangs from it. And in those quiet evenings, wearing his courtly robes in a farmhouse study, Machiavelli began to write. Not diplomatic dispatches, not reports for superiors who no longer existed, but something else, something dangerous. A book that would tell the truth about power. Not the comfortable truth that people wanted to hear, that virtue triumphs, that goodness prevails, that justice wins in the end. But the uncomfortable truth that he had lived. Power operates according to its own logic. Virtue alone is not enough. Justice is a luxury that only the secure can afford. And the rules that govern how power actually moves are very different from the rules we claim to follow. He would call this book De Principatibus, on principalities. Later, it would be known simply as The Prince. And it would be written not from confidence, but from desperation. Not as instruction for tyrants, but as a confession from someone who had seen too much to pretend anymore. Now, there's something almost comic about this image. A man so desperate to reclaim his identity that he dresses in fancy robes to read books in a farmhouse, like wearing a tuxedo to eat microwave dinners alone. But I think we all do some version of this, don't we? We all have those private rituals that remind us we're more than our current circumstances. The person who puts on nice clothes to work from home, even though no one will see them. The one who sets the table properly for a meal they're eating alone. The small dignities we maintain when the world has stripped away the larger ones. Machiavelli in his courtly robes, reading Livy in a farmhouse, arguing with ghosts about the nature of power. It's sad, yes, but it's also deeply human. We all need to remember who we were before circumstance made us smaller. Sometimes exile is the only place where you can be yourself. By the end of 1513, Machiavelli had completed his manuscript. It was short, only about 25,000 words, 26 chapters, dense, efficient, written in Italian rather than Latin, so that it could be widely read, not just by scholars but by anyone who wanted to understand power. But understand this, The Prince was not written as a philosophical treatise. It was written as a job application. Machiavelli was desperate. He was in exile. He was poor. He was irrelevant. And relevance was the thing he feared more than poverty, more than pain, perhaps even more than death. To be forgotten. To have spent his life accumulating wisdom about power and then to disappear without that wisdom mattering, that was the torture no Strappado could match. So he wrote The Prince, and he dedicated it to a Medici, first to Giuliano de' Medici, the Pope's brother. When Giuliano died suddenly in 1516, Machiavelli rededicated it to Lorenzo de' Medici, Duke of Urbino, grandson of Lorenzo the Magnificent. The irony is almost unbearable. The family that had tortured him, exiled him, destroyed his career, he was now offering them his life's work, his deepest insights, his most honest observations. Why? Because he wanted to get back in. He wanted his career restored. He wanted to be useful again. In his letter to Vittori, Machiavelli is achingly clear about this. I am wearing myself out, and I can see that if these Medici princes don't employ me, they will leave me to rot. And I need them to employ me, even if they put me to work rolling stones. Even if they put me to work rolling stones. This is the man who had negotiated with kings, who had advised on military strategy, who had built a citizen militia and helped recapture Pisa, and he would settle for meaningless labor, if it meant being acknowledged again, if it meant mattering. The dedication at the beginning of The Prince reads with painful humility. Machiavelli offers his book as a small gift, the only thing of value he has left to give. He apologizes for its plainness, its directness, its lack of elaborate literary flourishes. He says that he hopes Lorenzo will find it useful, that it might demonstrate his understanding of statecraft, that it might earn him consideration for even the smallest position. It's the plea of a desperate man trying to leverage the one asset he has left: knowledge. But here's what makes The Prince so extraordinary and so disturbing. Even while writing it as a job application, even while trying to flatter his way back into power, Machiavelli could not help but tell the truth. The book is not what you'd write if you were actually trying to ingratiate yourself with a powerful family. It's not filled with praise for Medici virtue or claims about their divine right to rule. It doesn't wrap harsh realities in comfortable platitudes. Instead, it's almost clinically honest about how power works, about the necessity of force, about the utility of fear, about the danger of trusting anyone, about the inevitable betrayals and reversals that come with political life. In other words, Machiavelli wrote a book that, if actually followed, would teach the Medici how to crush people exactly like Niccolo Machiavelli. This is either the most cynical job application ever written, or it's something else entirely. A Trojan horse, a warning disguised as advice, a way of saying, this is what you are, this is what you do. I'm going to explain it so clearly that even those who suffer under you will understand the mechanism. We'll never know for certain. Machiavelli never clarified his intentions. The Prince circulated in manuscript form among his friends, but it wasn't published during his lifetime. He sent copies to the Medici, but they never responded. No job offer came, no acknowledgement arrived. Lorenzo de' Medici, the book's dedicatee, probably never even read it. He died in 1519 at age 27, having spent his brief tenure as Duke of Urbino focused on military campaigns and court politics, not on reading unsolicited manuscripts from exiled civil servants. The irony compounds. Machiavelli poured his soul into this book, offered it as proof of his usefulness, hoped it would restore his relevance. And the person he was trying to impress didn't care enough to read it. But others did read it. Friends copied it, passed it around, whispered about its shocking contents. And gradually, the Prince began to develop a reputation, not as a gift to the Medici, but as something more dangerous. Let's look at what made it so disturbing. The book opens with a taxonomy of principalities, how they're acquired, how they're governed, how they're lost. It's organized like a manual, almost technical in its approach. But then come the chapters that made Machiavelli infamous, chapter 15, concerning things for which men, and especially princes, are praised or blamed. Here, Machiavelli makes his first shocking claim. It's better to focus on how things actually are, rather than how we wish they were. Many have imagined perfect republics and principalities, he says, but these imaginations are useless because they don't match reality. A prince who tries to be good in all circumstances will be destroyed by those who are not good. Therefore, a prince must learn when to not be good, when to set aside virtue for effectiveness. This was heresy. For centuries, advice books for rulers had preached virtue. Be merciful, be just, be honest, be generous. These were not just political recommendations, they were moral imperatives backed by Christian theology. Machiavelli said no. If you try to be virtuous all the time, you will fail. You will be taken advantage of. You will be destroyed by those who are more realistic about power. Chapter 17, concerning cruelty and clemency, and whether it is better to be loved than feared. This is where Machiavelli drops the line that would haunt his reputation forever. It is much safer to be feared than loved. But he doesn't just say this. He explains it. Love depends on others' gratitude, which is fickle. Fear depends on dread of punishment, which is reliable. People will abandon you when it suits them if they love you, but they'll obey you if they fear you, as long as that fear is maintained. Then comes the crucial qualification. A prince should avoid being hated. Fear and hatred are not the same thing. Fear can coexist with respect. Hatred cannot. How do you avoid being hated while maintaining fear? By not taking people's property arbitrarily. By not attacking their families without cause. By making your violence seem just, or at least necessary. Chapter 18, concerning the way in which princes should keep faith. Here, Machiavelli goes even further. He argues that a prince cannot always keep his word, cannot always be honest, cannot always honor his agreements. Why? Because the world is full of people who won't keep their word. And if you're the only one bound by your promises, while everyone else breaks theirs when convenient, you'll be destroyed. A prince must know how to be both fox and lion. The lion to scare off wolves, raw force against direct threats. The fox to recognize traps, cunning to avoid being deceived by those who appear friendly. And then, perhaps the most controversial sentence in the entire book. A prince should take great care never to utter anything that does not seem imbued with the 5 qualities: mercy, faith, integrity, humanity, and religion. And there is nothing more necessary than to seem to have this last quality. Seem, not be. Seem, appear virtuous, appear pious, appear honest, because people judge by appearances. But privately, when necessary, be willing to act against these virtues if that's what survival requires. This is not just advice about political tactics. This is an assault on the entire edifice of Christian political philosophy. It says that hypocrisy is not just common, it's necessary. That the performance of virtue matters more than virtue itself. That appearances can be weaponized. Chapter 25. Concerning the power of fortune over human affairs. Here, Machiavelli introduces his most complex idea, the relationship between Virtù and Fortuna. Fortuna, fortune, fate, luck, is like a violent river, he says. When it floods, it destroys everything in its path. No amount of skill or virtue can stop it in the moment. But wise men, in quiet times, build levees. They prepare. They shape the landscape so that when fortune turns violent, its force is channeled, controlled, minimized. Fortune controls about half of our actions, Machiavelli estimates. The other half we control through our choices, our preparations, our adaptability. The key is virtù, not virtue in the moral sense, but something more like effective action. The ability to read situations correctly and respond appropriately. To be bold when boldness works and cautious when caution works. To adapt your methods to circumstances rather than clinging rigidly to principles. Machiavelli uses an uncomfortable metaphor. Fortune is like a woman who must be mastered with force and audacity. It's a product of its time, reflecting Renaissance attitudes about gender. But the underlying point is about timing and decisiveness. Fortune favors those who act boldly when opportunity appears. Those who wait, who hesitate, who try to remain purely virtuous while the world around them operates by different rules, they get crushed. Not because they're bad people, but because they're rigid in a fluid situation. Even in manuscript form, circulated among friends, the prince generated immediate controversy. Some readers were shocked. This was not how you were supposed to talk about politics. You were supposed to pretend that power followed moral principles, that rulers should aspire to goodness, that justice and virtue would ultimately prevail. Machiavelli had torn off the mask and described what actually happened in palaces and courts. He'd given language to practices that everyone knew existed, but nobody discussed in public. Other readers were impressed, despite themselves. Here, finally, was someone willing to say what they'd all observed, but had been too polite, or too afraid, to articulate. But almost everyone agreed on one thing. This was dangerous. Because the prince didn't just describe power. It explained it. Made it teachable. Turned the instincts of successful rulers into a system that anyone could study and potentially apply. It democratized knowledge that had previously been the exclusive domain of those born into power. It said, here are the mechanisms, here is how it works. You don't need noble blood or divine right. You just need to understand the rules and be willing to follow them. This was threatening to everyone who held power, because power built on mystique is harder to challenge than power that's been reduced to a formula. And it was threatening to everyone who wanted to believe that the world operated according to moral principles. Because Machiavelli was saying, no, it doesn't, and pretending it does won't protect you. It will just make you vulnerable. You know, there's a certain irony to the fact that history's most controversial political manual was written by a man who just wanted his job back, who wanted someone, anyone, to return his call. It's like if someone wrote the most devastating critique of modern capitalism, not because they were a revolutionary, but because they desperately wanted to be hired by Amazon. Here's everything wrong with your system. Here's how it actually works beneath the rhetoric. Here's the ugly truth nobody admits. Please give me a middle management position. I'll take anything. Benefits aren't even necessary. Just let me matter again. History's most dangerous ideas are often born not from people trying to change the world, but from people trying not to be erased by it. But The Prince is more than just shocking advice. At its core is a philosophical framework that Machiavelli developed from his own experiences. Two concepts that dance around each other throughout the book, never quite reconciling, but always in tension. Virtù and Fortuna. Let's slow down here. Let these ideas settle. Because understanding them is understanding not just Machiavelli, but something essential about how to navigate a world that doesn't care about your plans. Fortuna is everything you cannot control. The circumstances of your birth, the era you live in, the natural disasters and diseases that strike without warning, the sudden death of a pope, the invasion by a foreign army, the conspiracy that happens to include your name on a list even though you weren't involved. It's the river that floods unpredictably, the wind that shifts without notice, the roll of dice that determines whether you're born in a palace or a hovel, whether your father dies when you're young, whether the plague strikes your city this year or the next. Fortuna is not evil. It's not even personal. It's just force, circumstance, the vast machinery of cause and effect that operates beyond your influence. Machiavelli estimated that Fortuna controls roughly half of human affairs. This was actually optimistic for his era. Many of his contemporaries would have said fortune controlled everything, that humans were merely pawns of fate. But Machiavelli had seen too much to believe in complete determinism. He'd seen some leaders navigate disasters while others were destroyed by the same circumstances. He'd seen clever adaptation overcome seemingly impossible situations. He'd seen fortune favor the prepared, even if it couldn't be fully controlled. Virtù is how you respond to what you cannot control. It's not virtue in the moral sense, not goodness or righteousness or adherence to ethical principles. It's something more primal. Effectiveness. The capacity to act decisively in the face of uncertainty. The ability to adapt your methods to changing circumstances. The willingness to do what works rather than what feels comfortable. Think of it as the difference between rigidity and flexibility, between having a fixed playbook and being able to read the game, between principles that never change and wisdom that knows when to change tactics while keeping core aims intact. A leader with virtù can look at a situation and understand what it requires, not what they wish it required, not what their ideology says it should require, but what it actually requires. Sometimes it requires mercy, sometimes cruelty, sometimes honesty, sometimes deception, sometimes boldness, sometimes patience. The leader without virtù tries to apply the same approach to every situation. They have one mode, always honest or always cautious or always aggressive. And when circumstances demand a different approach, they fail, not because they're bad people, but because they're inflexible. Machiavelli used Pope Julius II as an example of someone with virtù. Julius was impetuous, aggressive, always on the attack. This suited the circumstances of his papacy, when decisive action and military force were what the situation required. He succeeded because his nature matched his moment. But Machiavelli noted, if Julius had lived longer and circumstances had changed to require patience and negotiation, he probably would have failed, because he couldn't adapt. His virtù was real but limited. The ideal for Machiavelli would be someone who could be Julius when Julius was needed, and someone else entirely when that was needed. Someone whose identity was fluid enough to match whatever fortune demanded. This is deeply unsettling. It suggests there is no fixed self that should guide your actions, only a series of tactical responses to external circumstances. But Machiavelli had learned this lesson personally. When he served the Republic faithfully, following his principles, staying loyal, circumstances changed, and his loyalty became his liability. If he'd been more flexible, more willing to shift alliances when the Medici returned, he might have kept his position. But he didn't, and he suffered for it. Now, does this mean Machiavelli is advocating pure opportunism, complete moral flexibility, becoming whatever the moment requires with no core identity? Not quite. Remember, he dedicated his life to republican ideals. His other major work, The Discourses on Livy, is a lengthy argument for the virtues of republican government. He clearly had values. What he's saying is more subtle. Your values don't excuse you from responding to reality. Principles are important, but principles that get you killed without accomplishing anything are just another form of failure. The challenge, the impossible challenge, is to maintain your core commitments while being tactically flexible about how you pursue them. To know which hills are worth dying on and which battles require compromise. Machiavelli's metaphor of fortune as a violent river is crucial. You cannot stop the flood when it comes, but you can, in calm times, build the levees that will channel its force. This is why preparation matters, why studying history matters, why understanding patterns of power matters. Not because understanding gives you control. Machiavelli had been tortured precisely because he didn't have control, but because understanding gives you options, slightly better odds, a framework for making decisions under pressure. When fortune turns against you, and it will because fortune is cyclical and indifferent, you won't be able to prevent the damage entirely. But if you've prepared, if you've built your levies, if you've developed the skills and adaptability that constitute Virtù, you might survive what destroys others. Cesare Borgia had tremendous Virtù. He was bold, adaptive, ruthless when necessary, merciful when strategic. He built a principality from nothing in hostile territory. But when his father died, Fortuna turning against him, his Virtù wasn't enough. The flood came too fast, too strong, and he was swept away. Savonarola had no Virtù, not in Machiavelli's sense. He had charisma and conviction, but not the flexibility or force to maintain power when circumstances shifted. When fortune turned against him, he had no levies. He was overwhelmed immediately. Machiavelli himself. He had analytical Virtù, the ability to read situations, understand patterns, adapt strategies, but he lacked the positional power to apply that understanding. He was a calculator without an engine. And when fortune turned against him, his insights didn't save him. This is the tragedy of the prince. It's written by someone who understands the system but cannot escape it. Someone who can explain how power works but doesn't have power. Someone who built theoretical levees that didn't stop his own drowning. As you lie here, in this quiet hour, consider this. What in your life is Fortuna, unchangeable given the hand you were dealt? And what is potentially Virtù, where you could adapt, where you could respond differently, where you're clinging to methods that don't match current circumstances? Most people, most of the time, confuse the two. They treat fortune as if it can be controlled through positive thinking or righteous indignation. Or they treat Virtù as if it's fixed. This is just who I am, I can't change. When really, they're just refusing to adapt. Machiavelli would ask, are you being destroyed by fortune? Or by your unwillingness to develop the Virtù the situation requires? Are you building levees during calm times? Or are you assuming the river will never flood because it hasn't flooded recently? And if you understood power, really understood it, the way Machiavelli did after watching, serving, analyzing, suffering, would you still want it? Or would you, like him, end up writing about it from exile, trying to teach a world that doesn't want to learn, hoping that your understanding might matter to someone somewhere, even if it didn't save you? These are questions without comfortable answers. Perfect questions for the edge of sleep, where uncomfortable truths can settle without demanding immediate resolution. Let them drift, let them dissolve into whatever dreams come next. We're not finished with Machiavelli yet. There's more to his story, more to his legacy, more to understand about what happened when the world finally read his dark confession. But for now, rest in the tension, in the space between what you can control and what controls you, between who you are and who circumstances might require you to become. Machiavelli wrote The Prince in that space, wearing his courtly robes in a farmhouse, conversing with ancient ghosts, trying to matter in a world that had already decided he didn't. And somehow, despite everything, despite the torture, the exile, the poverty, the irrelevance, he wrote something that would echo through centuries. That would make his name immortal, even if it couldn't make him powerful. Fortune had destroyed him. But Virtù, his particular brand of unflinching observation and painful honesty, would outlast Fortune's cruelty. That's something, not much, but something. There's a conversation happening right now, in boardrooms, in government offices, in therapy sessions, in late-night talks between partners, trying to understand why their relationship feels unbalanced. It goes something like this. Why don't people respect kindness? Why does being nice seem to invite exploitation? Why do the loud, aggressive people get promoted while the considerate ones get overlooked? This is the conversation Machiavelli was having 500 years ago. And the answer he arrived at is the one nobody wants to hear. Not because it's wrong, but because it's uncomfortable. Let's return to that infamous line. It is better to be feared than loved. For 5 centuries, this has been read as an endorsement of cruelty, as Machiavelli telling rulers to terrorize their subjects, as a celebration of tyranny. But read the full passage, read what comes before and after. Machiavelli is not saying fear is morally superior to love. He's not saying cruelty is better than kindness. He's saying something far more subtle and far more disturbing. Love is unreliable as a foundation for authority because it depends on the other person's continued good feelings. Fear is reliable because it depends on predictable consequences. Think about your own life. Be honest about it in this quiet darkness where honesty costs nothing. Who have you obeyed most consistently? The boss who was nice, who wanted to be your friend, who avoided difficult conversations, or the boss who had clear standards and enforced them without exception? The parent who said please and hoped you'd comply, or the parent who established that certain actions would definitely result in certain consequences? The relationship where boundaries were suggested gently and then ignored when you crossed them? Or the relationship where boundaries were clearly stated and actually maintained? This doesn't mean the kind person or the gentle parent or the forgiving partner is wrong. Love is valuable. Kindness matters. Gentleness has its place. But if you're trying to establish order, in a state, in an organization, in any system where coordination matters, you cannot rely on people's love for you to ensure cooperation. Because love is conditional. People love you when you make them feel good, when your leadership is easy, when following you costs them nothing, when your presence in their life is pleasant. The moment circumstances change, when you have to make an unpopular decision, when you have to enforce a standard that someone doesn't like, when being loyal to you becomes socially or professionally costly, love evaporates. Not always, not in everyone, but in enough people that you cannot build stable systems on it. Fear, on the other hand, and here's where Machiavelli is being precise in a way people miss, is not about random cruelty or sadistic violence. It's about predictable consequences. It's about people understanding that certain actions will definitely result in certain responses. That rules are real, that boundaries will be enforced, that the system has teeth. This creates a strange paradox. Predictable, proportional enforcement actually makes people feel safer than inconsistent kindness. Because when rules are enforced randomly, when consequences depend on someone's mood, when boundaries shift based on whoever's complaining loudest, people live in constant anxiety. They never know where they stand. But when the rules are clear and the enforcement is consistent, people relax. They know the score. They understand the game. They can navigate the system because the system is stable. Machiavelli had watched this play out repeatedly in Renaissance Italy. Leaders who tried to rule through love alone, like Savonarola, were overthrown the moment the crowd's affection shifted. Leaders who ruled through random terror, cruel one day, merciful the next, unpredictable and capricious, were eventually assassinated by people who couldn't stand the uncertainty. But leaders who established clear rules, enforced them consistently, and made their violence seem just or at least necessary, those leaders maintained power. Not because people loved them, but because people understood them, could predict them, could live their lives without constant fear of arbitrary punishment. This is why Machiavelli added the crucial qualifier. A prince must avoid being hated. Fear and hatred are not the same thing. You fear the judge who will sentence you if you commit a crime. You hate the judge who sentences you capriciously, who takes bribes, who applies laws unequally based on personal preference. You fear the parent who will definitely ground you if you break curfew. You hate the parent who grounds you sometimes, ignores it other times, and the difference seems to depend on their mood rather than your behavior. You fear the system that has real consequences. You hate the system that's unjust, arbitrary, personal. Machiavelli was mapping this distinction, not because he loved fear, but because he'd watched love fail as a governing principle too many times to pretend otherwise. And here's the uncomfortable question he's asking you, as you lie here in the darkness. When have you been most manipulated in your life? Was it by the person who had power over you and used it directly? Or by the person who claimed to have no power, who framed everything as requests and preferences, who made you feel guilty for not complying with their wishes because, "I'm not forcing you, I'm just asking"? The tyrant who says, "Do this" or "face consequences" is at least honest about the power dynamic. The manipulator who says, "I just want you to be happy, but I'm very disappointed you chose that," is wielding power while pretending not to. Machiavelli would recognize this immediately as a form of dishonesty. And dishonesty, in his framework, is worse than direct force, because it pretends to be something it's not. At least fear is honest. At least it acknowledges the power differential. At least it doesn't gaslight you into thinking you're making free choices, when really you're just responding to psychological pressure. This is why Machiavelli's reputation as an advocate for cruelty is so ironic. He was actually advocating for honesty about power, for acknowledging what's really happening instead of dressing it up in comfortable lies. He was saying, if you're going to wield power, be direct about it. Don't pretend you're not in control when you are. Don't manipulate people through guilt and obligation while claiming you're just being nice. Either exercise authority openly, with clear rules and consequences, or don't exercise it at all. But don't lie about it. Don't call manipulation love. Don't call arbitrary enforcement mercy. Don't call inconsistency flexibility. Name the thing. Own the thing. Make it predictable. Because predictable power, even when it's harsh, is more humane than unpredictable love. The question Machiavelli leaves hanging in the air, never quite answering it. If this is true, if fear is more reliable than love for maintaining order, what does that say about human nature? Are we naturally selfish? Naturally untrustworthy? Naturally requiring coercion to cooperate? Or are we simply realistic, understanding that people act in their own interest and that systems work best when they acknowledge this rather than pretending we're all selfless angels? Machiavelli never resolves this question. He just observes the pattern and reports what he sees. And what he sees is that every successful leader, whether they admit it or not, relies more on fear than love. They just call it something else. Accountability. Consequences. Standards. Boundaries. But strip away the euphemisms and you're left with the same structure. Do this or face predictable negative consequences. Is that cruel? Or is that just how cooperation works among humans who have competing interests and limited selflessness? You don't have to answer. The question itself is the point. Let it rest there, in the quiet, alongside all the other uncomfortable truths we'd rather not examine too closely. But Machiavelli wasn't finished disturbing people. If the fear versus love chapter made readers uncomfortable, Chapter 18 of The Prince made them genuinely angry. Because here, Machiavelli takes the final step. He doesn't just say, leaders need to use fear. He says leaders need to appear virtuous while being willing to act contrary to virtue when necessary. In other words, the performance of goodness matters more than actual goodness. Let that settle for a moment. Because this is the idea that got Machiavelli condemned as satanic. This is what made Machiavellian synonymous with evil. He wrote, "A prince should take great care never to let anything slip from his lips that is not full of the 5 qualities mentioned above. He should appear, upon seeing and hearing him, to be all mercy, all faithfulness, all integrity, all kindness, all religion." Appear, not be appear. And then the knife twist. And there is nothing more necessary than to seem to have this last quality. Religion, piety, moral authority. But Machiavelli continues, you cannot actually be these things all the time, because reality will require you to act against mercy, against faith, against integrity, against kindness, against religion. A prudent ruler cannot keep his word, nor should he, when keeping it works against him, and when the reasons that made him give it no longer apply. This is the statement that made Machiavelli infamous. This is what convinced generations of readers that he was teaching evil. But was he teaching it? Or was he just describing what he'd observed? Think about every politician you've ever watched, every corporate leader, every public figure who needs to maintain authority. They all perform virtue. They all speak about values, about principles, about doing the right thing. And then, when circumstances require it, they act contrary to those stated values, and they explain it away. I had to make a difficult choice. The situation changed. New information came to light. This doesn't violate my principles because elaborate rationalization. Machiavelli was simply stating explicitly what everyone does implicitly. Public figures wear masks. They perform the virtues their position requires them to display. But privately, they make decisions based on pragmatic calculation rather than moral principle. The mask is not optional. It's part of the job. Because, and this is Machiavelli's darkest observation, people don't actually want authentic leaders. They want leaders who make them feel good, who reflect their values back at them, who maintain the comfortable fiction that power operates according to moral principles. Men, in general, judge more by their eyes than by their hands, Machiavelli writes, because everyone can see but few can touch. Everyone sees what you appear to be. Few touch what you really are. Translation: most people judge you by your public presentation, not by your actual character or actions. Because most people are distant from you, They see only the performance, not the reality. Only those close to you, those who touch you, who work with you intimately, see the reality beneath the mask. And those people, if they're wise, will keep quiet about it, because they understand that the mask serves a purpose. This is not an instruction manual for becoming a hypocrite. It's an observation about how authority functions in human societies. The leader who admits they sometimes lie, sometimes break promises, sometimes act contrary to their stated values, that leader loses authority. Not because they're more dishonest than others, but because they're more honest about the dishonesty. The leader who maintains the performance, who frames every pragmatic decision as a principled choice, who wraps calculation in moral language, who never admits to the contradiction, that leader maintains authority. It's a game, a necessary game, but still a game. And Machiavelli, having observed this game played by dozens of rulers across his career, simply wrote down the rules. Now here's where it gets really interesting, and where Machiavelli's legacy becomes genuinely ambiguous. Was he endorsing this, saying rulers should be hypocrites? Or was he exposing it, revealing the mechanism so that everyone could see how they were being manipulated? We don't know. Machiavelli never clarified. The Prince can be read either way. As a manual, here's how to maintain power through strategic hypocrisy. Or as a warning, here's how you're being deceived by those in power. Now that you know the trick, you can protect yourself from it. Later philosophers, Rousseau most famously, argued that Machiavelli was actually writing for the people, not for princes. That the prince was a way of exposing tyranny's mechanisms by pretending to teach them. A Trojan horse, a subversive text disguised as a conservative one. There's evidence for this reading. Remember, Machiavelli's other major work, Discourses on Livy, is explicitly pro-republican, pro-freedom, skeptical of concentrated power. That book praises citizen virtue, checks and balances, the wisdom of republics over principalities. So why would someone who loved republican freedom write a manual for autocrats? Maybe he didn't. Maybe he wrote a manual that looked like it was teaching autocrats, but was actually teaching their subjects how autocrats think. Or maybe both readings are true. Maybe Machiavelli was genuinely offering advice to the Medici, hoping for a job, while simultaneously creating a document that would eventually undermine all autocratic authority by revealing its mechanisms. Maybe the genius of the Prince is that it works on multiple levels simultaneously. For the ruler reading it, practical advice. For the subject reading it, dangerous knowledge. For the scholar reading it, a mirror that reflects back whatever they bring to it. The text itself is a mask. You see in it what you're looking for. You know what's quietly hilarious about this whole appear virtuous while acting pragmatically advice. It's exactly how everyone already lives their daily lives. You appear interested in your co-workers' stories about their children, even though you're mentally reviewing your grocery list. You appear to agree with your boss's questionable decision, even though you're quietly updating your resume. You appear to be a patient, understanding person, even though internally you're screaming. Machiavelli just had the social grace to apply this to politics and call it statecraft instead of calling it surviving Monday morning meetings. The prince wearing a mask of virtue while calculating power plays is not fundamentally different from you nodding sympathetically while your neighbor explains their essential oils business for the 47th time. We're all performing. We're all wearing masks. We all say we should get coffee sometime, when we mean, I hope I never see you again. Machiavelli just suggested that maybe this was okay, maybe even necessary. Maybe the mask isn't hypocrisy. Maybe it's the social lubricant that lets us live together without constant brutal honesty tearing everything apart. After all, if everyone said exactly what they thought all the time, society would collapse in about 15 minutes. So maybe Machiavelli wasn't teaching tyranny. Maybe he was just describing Wednesday. The prince didn't destroy Machiavelli's reputation immediately. At first, it circulated quietly among friends in manuscript form. Some readers were fascinated, others were disturbed, but it was a private controversy, contained within intellectual circles. Then, in 1532, 5 years after Machiavelli's death, The Prince was published, printed, made widely available, and the world lost its mind. The Catholic Church was first to condemn it. In 1559, Pope Paul IV placed The Prince on the Index of Prohibited Books. The charge: promoting political immorality, undermining Christian ethics, encouraging rulers to act contrary to God's commandments. Protestant reformers agreed with Catholics for once. They denounced Machiavelli as a corrupter of princes, a teacher of wickedness, an enemy of Christian civilization. The name Machiavel entered English as a term for a scheming villain. In Shakespeare's time, stage villains would announce themselves as Machiavels, remorseless schemers who valued power over all else. Christopher Marlowe's play, The Jew of Malta, opens with a character called Machiavel saying, "I count religion but a childish toy, and hold there is no sin but ignorance." This wasn't actually Machiavelli's philosophy, but it became associated with him. The caricature overtook the reality. By the 1600s, Machiavellian had entered common usage, meaning cunning, deceitful, manipulative, willing to do anything for power. Even people who had never read The Prince knew that Machiavelli was evil. His name became shorthand for a particular kind of immoral pragmatism that respectable people were supposed to denounce. And here's the cruel irony. Machiavelli was being condemned not for being uniquely evil, but for being uniquely honest about what everyone already did. He didn't invent political deception. He didn't create the practice of rulers lying to their subjects, breaking promises, using force to maintain power. All of that existed long before he was born and would continue long after he died. He just wrote it down, explained it, made it explicit. And for this, for refusing to maintain the comfortable fiction that power operates according to moral principles, he was branded as satanic. Think about what this means. The rulers who actually practiced deception, who broke treaties, who executed rivals, who manipulated populations, they were often celebrated, called great, or strong, or effective. Monuments were built to them. Histories praised them. But the man who observed these practices and described them honestly, condemned, vilified, transformed into a cautionary tale about the dangers of cynicism. It's as if the world could tolerate the actual cruelty of power, as long as nobody spoke about it directly, as long as everyone maintained the polite fiction that rulers were guided by virtue and moral principle. Machiavelli's crime was not advising cruelty. It was naming it, making it visible, turning the implicit into the explicit. He was punished not for creating evil, but for refusing to pretend it didn't exist. This is a pattern that repeats throughout history. The person who points out the emperor has no clothes becomes the villain, not the emperor. The whistleblower gets prosecuted, not the corruption they exposed. The messenger gets shot repeatedly, while the message gets ignored. Machiavelli became the scapegoat for everyone's discomfort with how power actually operates. Political leaders could read The Prince privately, absorb its lessons, apply them in their own governance, but publicly denounce Machiavelli to signal their virtue. Intellectuals could recognize the accuracy of his observations, but frame them as dangerous to maintain their own moral standing. Everyone could benefit from the clarity he provided, while condemning him for providing it. He became useful and infamous simultaneously, influential and reviled, essential and unmentionable. Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France, allegedly kept the prince on her bedside table. King Frederick the Great of Prussia wrote a lengthy refutation of it, anti-Machiavel, that was basically just Machiavelli's advice reframed in more acceptable language. Napoleon studied it. Thomas Cromwell owned a copy. Anyone who wielded power found something valuable in it. But none of them wanted to admit it. Because admitting you learned from Machiavelli was admitting you understood that power requires compromise, that virtue alone is insufficient, that the game has rules that contradict Sunday school lessons. So Machiavelli remained the villain, the one you quoted to prove your sophistication but denounced to prove your morality. In a sense, he predicted this. He wrote in The Prince that leaders must appear virtuous while acting pragmatically, and everyone who read his work followed that advice perfectly, including appearing to reject Machiavelli himself while privately implementing his insights. The irony is so perfect it almost seems intentional. By making power's mechanisms explicit, Machiavelli made himself the sacrifice necessary to maintain power's comfortable opacity. Everyone could point at him and say, "That's the bad one. That's the immoral approach," while quietly doing exactly what he described. He became the mask they wore, the villain they performed rejection of, the cautionary tale that let them feel virtuous while acting pragmatically. And through it all, through centuries of condemnation, through being turned into a stage villain, through having his name become synonymous with evil, his observations remained accurate. Fear is more reliable than love for maintaining authority. Leaders do perform virtue while acting pragmatically. Appearances matter more than reality in public perception. Fortune determines more than we want to admit. Power operates according to its own logic, regardless of our moral preferences. These things were true in Renaissance Italy. They're true now. They'll be true tomorrow. Condemning Machiavelli didn't change them. It just made everyone more comfortable pretending they weren't true. But here's what makes Machiavelli genuinely complex. What prevents him from being just a cynical advocate for tyranny? He loved republics. He genuinely believed in freedom. He thought the best government was one where citizens participated, where power was distributed, where checks and balances prevented any single person from accumulating too much authority. The Prince is only one book, and it's his shortest work. His longest work, Discourses on Livy, is 3 times as long and explicitly argues for republican government, for citizen virtue, for the superiority of free states over principalities, for the idea that humans are capable of self-governance when institutions are properly designed. So, how do you reconcile these two Machiavellis? The one who wrote The Prince, which reads like a manual for autocrats, and the one who wrote Discourses on Livy, which reads like a defense of democracy. This is the central paradox of his legacy, and it's never been fully resolved. Some scholars argue he was simply being practical. The Prince was about how existing principalities could be maintained, while Discourses was about the ideal government he wished could exist. Different books for different purposes. Others argue The Prince was strategic, written to gain favor with the Medici, not because he actually believed in autocracy. A job application, not a philosophical statement. Still others argue The Prince was subversive, exposing tyranny's mechanisms to undermine it, while Discourses presented the alternative. Machiavelli himself never clarified. He left the contradiction hanging. But maybe the contradiction is the point. Maybe Machiavelli had learned something more complex than republics good, princes bad, or princes effective, republics idealistic. Maybe he'd learned that humans are complicated, that we're capable of both civic virtue and selfish betrayal, that we can build systems of freedom that work beautifully until they don't, that we can create checks on power that succeed until someone finds a way around them. His experience suggested a tragic wisdom. The best government is a republic with engaged citizens who care about the common good. But such governments are fragile. They require constant vigilance, civic virtue, and favorable circumstances. When any of those elements fail, when citizens become apathetic, when external threats overwhelm institutional safeguards, when fortune turns against you, you need something else. Something less beautiful but more durable. A prince with the strength to impose order. Not because autocracy is better, but because sometimes it's the only thing that prevents complete collapse. This is not a comfortable conclusion. It suggests that the forms of government we prefer may not be the ones that survive. That our ideals may need to be suspended when circumstances become dire. That freedom is a luxury of peaceful times, not a guaranteed right in all conditions. Republican Machiavelli would have hated this conclusion, but realist Machiavelli couldn't deny what he'd seen. Florence's republic collapsed when external force arrived. Citizen virtue evaporated when fear took over. The institutional safeguards that looked strong in peacetime proved fragile under pressure. Meanwhile, principalities, even harsh ones, could survive shocks that destroyed republics. Not because princes were better people, but because concentrated power is more adaptable than distributed power in crisis situations. A republic needs time for deliberation, consensus, procedural legitimacy. A prince can act immediately, decisively, without waiting for approval. In stable times, the republic's deliberation creates better decisions. In crisis, the prince's speed creates survival. So which is better? Machiavelli's answer seems to be both, neither. It depends. In the peaceful, prosperous times, build republics, distribute power, cultivate civic virtue, create checks and balances, let citizens govern themselves. But don't be naive. Know that if circumstances change dramatically, if war comes, if plague strikes, if the economy collapses, your beautiful republican institutions might not survive, and you might need to accept temporary concentration of power just to prevent complete chaos. The challenge is, temporary powers have a way of becoming permanent. The prince who seizes authority just until the crisis passes rarely gives it back willingly. The emergency measures that seem necessary in the moment create precedents that last for generations. This is the knife's edge Machiavelli was trying to describe. The impossible balance between order and freedom, between security and liberty, between pragmatic survival and principled living. Republican at heart, because he genuinely believed humans flourish most under self-governance. Realist by experience, because he'd watched idealistic republics crumble when fortune turned against them. The tension never resolves. You can't have perfect freedom and perfect security. You can't have a government that's both maximally responsive to citizen will and maximally stable under pressure. You can't have institutions that never fail and never require suspension of normal procedures. You have to choose. Or rather, circumstances choose for you. And all you can do is understand the trade-offs and try not to lie to yourself about what you're sacrificing. This is why Machiavelli remains relevant. Because every generation faces this same tension. Every society has to negotiate between freedom and security, between ideals and pragmatism, between the government we want and the government that can actually survive the challenges we face. And every generation has people who want simple answers, who insist that either freedom always works or security always works, that either virtue is enough or force is necessary, that either idealism or realism is the complete answer. Machiavelli offers no simple answers, just the uncomfortable insistence that you understand the real trade-offs, that you know what you're giving up and what you're gaining, that you don't pretend you're maintaining principles when you're actually compromising them. Be Republican when you can be. Be pragmatic when you must be. But don't lie about which one you're doing. That's as close as Machiavelli gets to a unified philosophy. It's not satisfying, it's not comforting, but it's honest. And honesty, in the end, was the only thing he couldn't compromise on, even when it cost him everything. There's something both tragic and funny about how history treats complexity. We want our thinkers to be simple, good or bad, right or wrong, team freedom or team order. Pick a lane, give us a bumper sticker slogan. And here's Machiavelli saying, well, it depends on circumstances, and sometimes you need to balance contradictory values, and perfect solutions don't exist, and history responds, too complicated. You're evil. We're putting you in the villain box. It's like trying to explain to someone that you can love your job, but also recognize its problems, and they respond, so you hate your job. Got it. No, I just said it's more nuanced than, yep, total job hater. That's going on your tombstone. Machiavelli was trying to be intellectually honest about trade-offs, and history wrote on his tombstone, here lies Satan's political advisor. Close enough, I suppose. Let's return to the question that has haunted Machiavelli's legacy for 5 centuries. Was the prince actually teaching tyranny? Or was it exposing tyranny? Jean-Jacques Rousseau, writing in the 1700s, proposed something radical. Machiavelli was an honest man and a good citizen. While appearing to give lessons to kings, he gave great lessons to peoples. Machiavelli's Prince is the book of republicans. What if the prince was not advice for tyrants, but a warning for their subjects? What if Machiavelli was deliberately showing how manipulation works so that people could recognize when they were being manipulated? What if the whole book is a form of inoculation, exposing the mechanisms of power so they lose their power to deceive? There's evidence for this reading. First, Machiavelli had spent his career serving a republic. He was a committed republican. Why would he suddenly write a sincere manual for autocrats? Second, the book is almost too honest. If you actually wanted to teach a prince how to manipulate people, you wouldn't write it all down where everyone could read it. You'd teach it privately, in whispers, the way power actually transmits itself. Third, by making the mechanisms explicit by saying, here's how a prince appears virtuous while acting pragmatically. Here's how fear works better than love. Here's how to use cruelty strategically. Machiavelli makes these tactics less effective. Because manipulation works best when its targets don't know they're being manipulated. It's like a magician publishing a detailed explanation of how their illusions work. Sure, other magicians might learn something, but the real effect is that audiences can no longer be fooled the same way. Once you know the trick, the magic disappears. So maybe the prince is a magic trick explained. A way of showing people. Here's how your rulers are deceiving you. Here's the performance they're giving. Here's what's actually happening behind the mask. And maybe Machiavelli disguised this exposé as advice to make it publishable. Because if he'd written, "Citizens, your leaders are lying to you. Here's how," that book would never have circulated. He would have been arrested again and possibly executed. But by framing it as advice to princes, he could get the information out there. He could reveal the mechanisms. He could arm people with knowledge. This reading makes Machiavelli not a villain, but a hero. Not Satan's advisor, but a whistleblower. Not the father of tyranny, but the man who exposed tyranny's operating manual so thoroughly that it could never work the same way again. It's a compelling theory, and there are scholars who genuinely believe it. But here's the problem. We don't know. Machiavelli never said this is what he was doing. He could have. Later in life, when the manuscript was circulating and generating controversy, he could have clarified, "No, you misunderstand. This was meant as a warning, not as instruction." He didn't. He let the ambiguity stand. So either A. He was genuinely trying to advise the Medici and regain his position, which means the prince is sincere, if desperate, instruction for autocrats. B. He was deliberately creating a subversive text disguised as conventional advice, and he kept quiet about it because revealing the strategy would undermine it. C. He was doing both, sincerely trying to get rehired while also creating a text that worked on multiple levels, teaching princes while simultaneously exposing them. D. He genuinely didn't know himself. He was writing from exile, from pain, from desperation, and the book emerged as a mixture of genuine insight, strategic calculation, and emotional confusion. The text itself doesn't resolve this. It can be read any of these ways. It's a mirror that reflects back your assumptions about power, about human nature, about whether honesty is subversive or conventional wisdom is corrupting. Maybe that's the point. Maybe Machiavelli created something that works regardless of his intention. That teaches and exposes simultaneously. That can be used by princes and defended against by citizens. That's both manual and warning, both description and prescription. The prince is a weapon that points in multiple directions at once. Who gets hurt by it depends on who's holding it and who's standing where when it fires. This ambiguity has kept it alive for half a millennium, because it never stops being relevant. Each generation finds new ways to read it, new lessons to extract, new controversies to argue over. Is Machiavelli the villain or the hero? Is the prince evil or enlightening? The answer might be yes, both, neither. It depends on what you do with what you learn from it. But underneath all the philosophical complexity, all the political theory, all the analysis of power, there was something simpler driving Machiavelli: fear of irrelevance. In his letters from exile, this fear appears again and again. The ache of being discarded, of having spent his life accumulating expertise that nobody wanted, of watching younger men fill positions he once held, making decisions he could have made better, influencing events he could have shaped. He writes to Vittori, "I'm wasting away, and if God doesn't help me, I'll become contemptible." He writes, "Fortune has determined that since I don't know how to talk about the silk trade or the wool trade or about profit and loss, I must talk about politics." He writes, "I'll talk about politics with anyone who'll listen, because that's all I have left." This is the wounded pride of someone who knows they're valuable, but cannot convince anyone else of their value. The desperate energy of a person trying to remain relevant in a world that's moved on. The prince was his Hail Mary, his last attempt to prove he still mattered. his way of saying, I may be in exile, but I understand power better than the people you've chosen to listen to instead of me. And when the Medici didn't respond, when Lorenzo didn't even read it, when no job offer came, when the book circulated but changed nothing about his situation, Machiavelli must have felt the ground disappearing beneath him. He'd played his last card, revealed his deepest insights, offered everything he had, and it wasn't enough. This is a particular kind of death. Not physical death, but the death of mattering. The death of influence, the death of being someone whose opinion changes outcomes. For someone who had spent 14 years advising on war and peace, negotiating with kings, shaping Florence's policies, exile wasn't just geographic removal. It was ontological erasure. He ceased to exist in the world that defined him, so he wrote. Not just The Prince. He wrote plays, poetry, histories. He wrote constantly, compulsively, as if the act of writing itself could keep him tethered to relevance. In 1520, the Medici finally threw him a bone. Cardinal Giulio de' Medici, later Pope Clement VII, commissioned him to write a history of Florence. It was minor work. It paid poorly. But it was acknowledgement. It was something. Machiavelli worked on the Florentine histories for 5 years. He tried to make them excellent. Tried to prove that even in his 60s, even after everything, he could still produce valuable work. The histories are actually quite good. Insightful, well-written, analytical. But they're not what he's remembered for. The Prince is what he's remembered for. The book he wrote from desperation. The book that didn't get him rehired. The book that made him infamous instead of influential. And here's the final irony. His fear of being forgotten was completely unfounded. He became one of the most famous political thinkers in history. His name entered the language. His insights shaped centuries of political thought. But he died thinking he'd failed. Died believing his expertise had been wasted. Died without knowing that the Prince would outlive empires, outlive religions, outlive entire civilizations. He feared irrelevance and achieved immortality. But he achieved it posthumously, when immortality couldn't comfort him anymore. June 21st, 1527. Niccolo Machiavelli died at his home in Florence. He was 58 years old. The cause was likely peritonitis, abdominal infection, possibly from contaminated medicine. He'd been suffering from stomach pain for several days. Then suddenly, he was gone. Just weeks before his death, Florence had gone through yet another political convulsion. The Medici had been expelled again. The Republic had been restored. Machiavelli, hoping once more for a position in the revived Republican government, had been passed over, again. The hardline Republicans didn't trust him because of his later connections to the Medici. The moderates didn't need him because they had their own people. So he died as he'd lived the last 14 years. Outside the halls of power, watching, wanting to contribute, unable to get anyone to listen. His son Piero reported that before he died, Machiavelli experienced a dream or vision. In it, he saw 2 groups of people. The first group was ragged and miserable. When he asked who they were, they said they were the blessed souls going to paradise, the humble, the poor in spirit, the meek. The second group was dressed magnificently, engaged in deep philosophical discussion. When he asked who they were, they said they were the damned, going to hell for their sins, but at least they'd have interesting conversation for eternity. Machiavelli told his son, "I'd rather go to hell with the philosophers than to heaven with the pious." It's probably apocryphal. Deathbed stories usually are. But it's perfectly Machiavellian, choosing honesty and intellectual engagement over comfortable piety, choosing the interesting sinners over the boring saints. He was buried in the church of Santa Croce in Florence. A simple tomb initially. No grand monument, no recognition of his service to the city, just, here lies Niccolo Machiavelli. Later, much later, they added a grander monument. An inscription, Tanto nomini, nullum par elogium. No eulogy is adequate for such a name. But when he died, there was no eulogy, no state funeral, no acknowledgement from the Medici, no recognition from the republic he'd served. He died as he'd feared, forgotten by the people he'd tried so hard to advise. The Prince was published 5 years after his death. Then, Discourses on Livy. Then his other works. And gradually, very gradually, people began to read them, discuss them, argue about them. The controversy built slowly. The condemnations came, the papal prohibition, the theatrical caricatures, the transformation of his name into an adjective meaning evil. But also, quietly, privately, the influence spread. Rulers read him, philosophers grappled with him, military strategists studied him. Anyone who wanted to understand power found something valuable in his work. He'd wanted to matter in his lifetime. He mattered after it instead. He'd wanted to shape events as they happened. He shaped how people thought about events for centuries afterward. He'd wanted to be powerful. He became influential, which is actually more durable. Because power is positional and temporary. You hold it for a while, then you lose it and someone else holds it. But influence, ideas that change how people think, that can ripple forward through time, affecting people who never heard your name, shaping decisions in contexts you never imagined. Machiavelli never ruled anything. But he changed how everyone thought about ruling. He never held power, but he revealed how power actually operates. He never achieved the relevance he craved in his lifetime, but he achieved something stranger and more lasting. He became a permanent part of how we understand politics. Not as a hero, not as a villain, but as the person who removed the comfortable mask and showed us what was underneath. So what do we do with Niccolo Machiavelli? How do we hold him in our minds as we drift toward sleep? He's not a comfortable figure, not a role model in any conventional sense. He offers no moral certainties, no inspirational message about goodness triumphing, no reassurance that virtue is its own reward. Instead, he offers something harder and possibly more valuable: clarity. Clarity about how power actually works, as distinct from how we wish it worked. Clarity about the difference between intentions and outcomes, between principles and pragmatism, between what we claim to value and what we actually respond to. Clarity about the uncomfortable fact that the world does not arrange itself according to our moral preferences. This clarity is not cynicism. Cynicism is the belief that nothing matters, that all action is pointless, that humans are irredeemably selfish. Machiavelli was not a cynic. He cared deeply about Florence. He believed republics could work. He thought civic virtue was possible and valuable. But he also believed that idealism without realism is a beautiful way to fail. That virtue without force is borrowed time. That understanding how power operates is not the same as endorsing how power operates. He's teaching a kind of clear-eyed engagement with the world. Not optimism, not pessimism, but realism that might let you navigate complexity without being destroyed by it. As you lie here, in this quiet hour between waking and sleep, consider what Machiavelli is really asking. Do you understand the real rules of the systems you're in? Or are you operating according to rules you wish existed? When you've been hurt by institutions, by organizations, by relationships, were you hurt by evil? Or by your own misunderstanding of how those systems actually work? When you've seen cold, ruthless people succeed while kind, principled people struggle, are you witnessing injustice? Or are you witnessing the natural consequences of different strategies in a world that rewards certain behaviors regardless of their moral qualities? When you perform virtue, when you say things you don't quite believe, when you maintain appearances that don't match reality, when you present one face to the world and reserve another for private moments, are you being a hypocrite? Or are you just navigating the same game Machiavelli described? And most importantly, if you truly understood power, if you saw its mechanisms as clearly as Machiavelli did, would you still want it? Or would you, like him, end up writing about it from a distance, trying to teach people who don't want to learn, hoping your understanding might matter, even if you never hold influence again? Machiavelli's tragedy was that he wanted to matter, and ended up mattering only after he stopped mattering to anyone personally. His gift to us is that he was honest when honesty was dangerous. He described reality when describing reality was heretical. He said the quiet part out loud when everyone else was pretending the quiet part didn't exist. And because he did this, because he wrote The Prince and Discourses and his other works with unflinching clarity, we inherited a framework for understanding power that's never been surpassed. We don't have to agree with him. We don't have to like him. We don't have to endorse his conclusions. But we can use his observations. We can benefit from his clarity. We can see the patterns he mapped and recognize them in our own lives, our own institutions, our own times. Power as weather, not morality. Fear as structure, not evil. Love as signal, not foundation. Virtue as performance, not essence. Fortune as force, not injustice. These are not comfortable truths, but they're useful truths, the kind that might help you navigate a complex world without being destroyed by your own naivete. Niccolo Machiavelli never ruled, never commanded armies, never sat on any throne. He observed, he analyzed, he wrote, and somehow, from those quiet activities, from watching carefully and thinking clearly and refusing to lie about what he saw, he created something that outlasted every prince he studied, every republic he served, every power structure he analyzed. His body returned to dust. His reputation became a caricature. His name became a cautionary tale. But his observations remained true. His patterns remained accurate. His clarity remained valuable. That's a strange kind of immortality. Not the kind anyone would choose. Not glorious, not comfortable, but real. You're lying here, centuries later, thinking about him, considering his ideas, measuring them against your own experience, finding them uncomfortably relevant. He would have appreciated that, not because he was arrogant, but because he desperately wanted to matter, wanted his expertise to be valued, wanted someone, somewhere, to benefit from what he'd learned through pain and observation. And you are benefiting. By thinking more clearly about power, by understanding the mechanisms, by being slightly less naive about how the world operates. That was his gift. That's what survives. Now let it all dissolve. Let Machiavelli fade back into history. Let the questions rest unanswered. Let the discomfort settle without resolution. You don't need to solve power. You don't need to reconcile virtue and effectiveness. You don't need to decide if he was hero or villain, teacher or corrupter, prophet or cynic. You just need to rest. The patterns will still be there tomorrow. Power will still operate according to its own logic. Fortune will still turn without consulting you. People will still perform virtue while calculating advantage. But tonight, let it go. Let your breath slow. Let your thoughts drift. Let the weight of analysis lift. Somewhere in Renaissance Italy, a middle-aged man in exile puts on his courtly robes and sits among his books, conversing with ancient authors about the nature of power. He's trying to understand, trying to matter, trying to ensure that his suffering teaches someone something valuable. You've listened, you've learned something, you've given him what he wanted, relevance that outlasted his lifetime. That's enough. Let him rest now. Let yourself rest. The world will still be broken in the morning. Power will still operate according to uncomfortable rules. People will still navigate between ideals and pragmatism. But tonight, rest. Let wisdom settle into dreams. Let questions dissolve into sleep. Let Machiavelli's ghost finally find peace, knowing he mattered, knowing he taught, knowing his honesty survived 5 centuries of condemnation. And let yourself find peace too. The observer who never ruled has taught his final lesson. Understanding power is not the same as possessing power. Seeing clearly is not the same as being happy. Truth is not the same as comfort. But it's something. It's real. It's honest. And sometimes that's all we can offer each other. The truth as clearly as we can see it, without the comfortable lies that make it easier to swallow. Sleep now. Let the truth rest beside you, unresolved but acknowledged. Tomorrow, you'll wake up in a world that's still complicated, still unfair, still operating according to rules you didn't write. But you'll understand those rules a little better. See the patterns a little more clearly. Navigate the complexity with slightly more wisdom. Because a man who lived 500 years ago, who was tortured and exiled and forgotten, who died thinking he'd failed, that man wrote down what he saw with unflinching honesty. And his honesty reached forward through time to find you here, in this quiet darkness, seeking wisdom for sleep. Rest well, nightling. Let Machiavelli rest too. The questions will keep. The patterns will persist. The truth will wait. But tonight, just breathe. Just be. Just sleep. Since you made it this far, I'm glad you enjoyed the episode. If you would like to continue listening to episodes with similar themes, I made playlists of our most popular videos and themes like Most Boring and Calm playlist or Deepest Life Lessons playlist. Check the links in the description below. Sweet dreams, nightlings, and may you wake tomorrow with a clearer mind, a calmer heart, and the courage to bring your dreams to reality. See you next time.